In the spring of 1963, as George Demonsfield was getting ready to leave Dallas for his new oil contract in Haiti, Marina Oswald began to form a relationship with Ruth Paine, whom she had just met at a party at Everett Glover's house. A few other things happened around this time that are pivotal to the story of Lee Harvey Oswald. On March 13th, an order for a Maniquao Carcano rifle was sent to Klein's Sporting Goods in Chicago from Oswald's supposed alias, Alec Heidel. We don't know when the rifle was picked up, if it was, because there's no record of it actually being picked up by Oswald. According to the Warren Commission, on March 31, 1963, Marina Oswald took the infamous backyard photo of her husband Lee, which showed him with a pistol on his side, holding the Maniquao Carcano rifle, as well as 2 Russian newspapers. A few days later, on April 10th, a racist general named Edwin Walker was shot at from outside of his home after President Kennedy and Officer Tippit were killed. The authorities later tied the Walker shooting to Lee Harvey Oswald. In upcoming episodes, we'll cover the backgrounds of Ruth and Michael Paine, as well as the backyard photos and the General Walker shooting. But first, in this episode, we have a lot more left to unpack when it comes to George de Mansfield, including his business contacts related to Haiti, his relationship and written correspondence with former President George H.W. Bush, the story of Willem Altmans and the mysterious circumstances surrounding de Mansfield's death by shotgun blast. Since George de Mansfield is potentially such a huge character in the assassination story, a more thorough look into his activities before and after he knew Lee Harvey Oswald may help to clarify his motive for building a relationship with Oswald. In the late 1930s, when he first arrived in the United States, de Mansfield worked for Shoemaker Company, whose CEO, Pierre Fries, was a French intelligence agent. De Mansfield even did some intelligence work on behalf of the French government in the United States. This work involved de Mansfield contacting American oil companies and asking them to sell to the French instead of the Germans as competition for oil increased during the lead-up to World War II. On March 13, 1963, as de Mansfield was nearing the end of his time with Oswald, he secured a surveying contract with the Haitian government for $285,000, worth about $2.85 million in today's American dollars. In the spring of 1963, as he was preparing for his upcoming contract in Haiti, de Mansfield met in Washington, D.C. with Department of Defense personnel and his Haitian business partner, Clement Joseph Charles. Declassified CIA files show that on May 7, 1963, Dorothy Matlock from the Office of the Army Chief of Staff for Intelligence arranged a meeting between Clem Charles herself and Tony Zukowski of the CIA. She also made hotel reservations for Clem Charles and George de Mansfield. Matlock had been informed about Clem Charles visiting the United States by an Army intelligence colonel who encouraged her to speak with him, given Haiti's strategic importance when it came to Cuba and Clem Charles' close ties to the Haitian dictator Papa-Doc Duvalier. When it came time for the meeting, Matlock was surprised when George and John de Mansfield both attended, even though they hadn't been invited. Matlock told the HSCA that she felt that de Mansfield, quote, dominated Charles in some way, but she didn't know what exactly his role was. In 1963, the American government had a program to encourage Caribbean countries to grow jute, which is a hemp-like crop that can be used to make rope and other fibers. Joseph Dreyer worked for this federal government program and met George de Mansfield while he was doing work on jute promotion in Haiti. When Dreyer was interviewed by an HSCA committee investigator, the investigator gave him a list of names and asked Dreyer whether he had heard de Mansfield mention any of those names. Dreyer said that he recognized 2 of the names on the list, Dorothy Matlock, the woman de Mansfield had met with from Army intelligence, and William Avery Hyde, who worked for the U.S. Agency for International Development, and before that the International Cooperation Administration. William Avery Hyde is also the father of Ruth Paine. So, we have George de Mansfield meeting with Army intelligence and the CIA shortly before he goes to Haiti, and then we have the somewhat tenuous but nevertheless show-stopping claim that George de Mansfield knew Ruth Paine's dad. On top of all that, we learned in 2022 from a declassified memo that the CIA was actively looking for George de Mansfield in late April of 1963, but they couldn't find him. We never learned exactly why they were looking for him, or why this document was so sensitive that it was just declassified in 2022. Not only did de Mansfield know Jackie Kennedy's mother and possibly Ruth Paine's father, he also knew the future 41st President of the United States, George Herbert Walker Bush, one of de Mansfield's early oil business partners. Eddie Hooker was Bush's roommate and close friend. While at Phillips Academy in Massachusetts, de Mansfield also did oil consulting work with Thomas Devine, who was Bush's business partner in his oil company, Zapata Offshore. At the same time, Devine was working with George H.W. Bush. It turns out that he was also working for the CIA. In September of 1976, George de Mansfield began to notice that he was being surveilled, but he didn't know by whom or for what reason. Not knowing what to do next, he sent a handwritten letter to his old friend George Bush, who by that time had risen to the position of director of the CIA. The letter said, quote, "Dear George, maybe you will be able to bring a solution into the hopeless situation I find myself in. My wife and I find ourselves surrounded by some vigilantes, our phone bugged, and we are being followed everywhere. Either FBI is involved in this, or they do not want to accept my complaints. We are driven to insanity by this situation. I tried to write stupidly and unsuccessfully about Lee H. Oswald, and I must have angered a lot of people. Could you do something to remove this net around us? This would be my last request for help, and I will not annoy you any more." George Bush then wrote an inter-office memo that said, quote, "I do know this man, de Mansfield. I first met him in the early 40s. He was an uncle to my Andover roommate. Later he surfaced in Dallas. He got involved in some controversial dealings in Haiti. Then he surfaced when Oswald shot to prominence. He knew Oswald before the assassination of President Kennedy, and I don't recall his role in all this. At one time, he had or spent plenty of money." Bush then wrote a letter back to de Mansfield in a friendly tone, and the substance of the letter was, quote, "In your situation, I can well imagine how the attention you described in your letter affects both you and your wife. However, my staff has been unable to find any indication of interest in your activities on the part of federal authorities in recent years. The flurry of interest that attended your testimony before the Warren Commission has long since subsided. I can only speculate that you have become newsworthy again in view of the renewed interest in the Kennedy assassination, and thus may be attracting the attention of people in the media. There's plenty more to discuss as it relates to former President George H.W. Bush's relationship to the Kennedy assassination. We'll cover those issues in a future episode. In March of 1977, George de Mansfield agreed to disclose some new information about the Kennedy assassination to Dutch journalist Willem Oltmans. Oltmans claimed that de Mansfield told him that he was part of a, quote, Dallas conspiracy of oil men and Cuban exiles with a, quote, blood debt to settle. He also told Oltmans that Oswald had, quote, acted at his guidance and instruction. As part of Oltmans' interviews with de Mansfield, the two men traveled together to the Netherlands, where de Mansfield left his personal belongings at Oltmans' home. A few days later, Oltman and de Mansfield flew to Brussels to meet a Soviet diplomat for lunch. After the diplomat said something to de Mansfield in Russian, it scared him so much that he got up and left the restaurant in Brussels, never to be seen again by Oltmans, even though Oltmans had all of de Mansfield's luggage and keys at his house. Willem Oltmans even testified to the HSCA in a closed-door session about what de Mansfield had told him. Here's an ABC News clip.
For 3 hours, Willem Oltmans was questioned closely about his uncorroborated story by the House Assassinations Committee. Although his committee testimony is secret, in public, Oltmans claimed that he'd been told of a conspiracy to kill President Kennedy, allegedly involving Texas oil interests, the late millionaire H.L. Hunt, 3 anti-Castro Cuban gunmen, Lee Harvey Oswald, and George de Mohrenschildt, a friend of Oswald's who committed suicide this week when the Assassinations Committee tried to get him to testify.
Mr. de Mohrenschildt told me in Dallas on the 23rd of February this year, that Oswald acted at his instructions and that they discussed the Kennedy assassination from A to Z, and that he knew that Kennedy was going to kill Oswald was going to kill President Kennedy sooner or later.
If Willem Oltman is telling the truth, then George de Mohrenschildt's position was that Oswald was involved and not just as a patsy, and that there were additional shooters involved as well. What I find interesting about this story is that the CIA is nowhere to be found in the conversation. We've outlined de Mohrenschildt's many intelligence connections, but if we are to believe Altman, the assassination was exclusively about oil and Cuban exiles. In an interesting move that's a tip of the cap to those with deep knowledge of the JFK assassination, director Oliver Stone cast Willem Oltmans to play the role of George de Mohrenschildt in Stone's classic film JFK. We've already discussed the many intelligence connections of George de Mohrenschildt, including French intelligence, the CIA, and Army intelligence. The circumstances of George de Mohrenschildt's death also add fuel to the idea that there's more than meets the eye when it comes to George de Mohrenschildt. On March 29, 1977, de Mohrenschildt was meeting with author Edward Epstein to give an interview for Epstein's book Legend: The Secret World of Lee Harvey Oswald. While de Mohrenschildt was giving his interview to Epstein, HSCA investigator Gaetan Fonzi stopped by the Manalapan, Florida beach house where de Mohrenschildt was staying. Fonzi spoke with de Mohrenschildt's daughter Alexandra. He left his card with her and told her that he would be calling her father that night to set up a time for him to interview her father the next day. Alexandra told Fonzi to call back after 8 o'clock. Around 6:30 that very same evening, Fonzi got a phone call from a friend of his who was a television reporter in Dallas at the time and would go on to cable news superstardom a few decades later, Bill O'Reilly. O'Reilly told Fonzi that he was reporting on a story about de Mohrenschildt finally being found by the HSCA, but he had heard that de Mohrenschildt was dead from suicide. He wanted to confirm this with Fonzi, who after all was the HSCA investigator. Unbeknownst to Fonzi, it was true that George de Mohrenschildt was dead. Around 2:20, a few hours after Fonzi had left his business card, de Mohrenschildt died of a shotgun blast to the head. Here's a clip of Alexandra de Mohrenschildt talking to Bill O'Reilly the day after her father died.
Getting back to Epstein for a minute, he came back from the interview with Epstein, and that's when the tragedy happened. Did he say anything to you about Epstein, or was he upset when he came back from
No, I talked to him and I said, how's everything going? He said, everything is fine. I said, how's Mr. Epstein? He said, oh, he's very nice, very intelligent. I said, do you have to go and see him again today? And my father said, no, I don't have to go and see him until tomorrow, which I understand was not true.
Wait a minute, you understand that was not true?
No, we had an appointment with Mr. Epstein at 3 o'clock, but he told me that he didn't have to go back.
You didn't talk to Epstein at all after that?
No, I did speak to Mr. Epstein, and he doesn't know.
Bill O'Reilly went on to write a best-selling book defending the Warren report called Killing Kennedy. In that book, O'Reilly claimed that he showed up at de Mohrenschildt's house on the day he died, and as O'Reilly was knocking on the door, he actually heard the shotgun blast that killed de Mohrenschildt. Of course, this is inconsistent with the story from Fonzi, but what Bill O'Reilly didn't know is that Gaetan Fonzi was recording their phone call. During that call, O'Reilly says point blank, "I'm coming to Florida tomorrow," which conclusively shows O'Reilly could not have been standing at the door when the shotgun was fired. Here's the tape of that call.
Hi, Gaten, Bill O'Reilly.
Yeah.
Look, something definitely did happen.
Yeah, I got it.
What is it?
He committed suicide up here in where I was trying to locate him.
Okay, where is that?
It's a place called Manalapan, Manalapan, Palm Beach County.
Okay. And that's a town, Manalapan?
Yeah, it's a section of Lantana.
Yeah.
Where the National Enquirer is.
Okay. So he committed suicide. He's dead.
Yeah.
Okay. What time?
Late this afternoon. I don't know.
Okay. Gun?
I think he said he shot himself.
Okay. Oh, Jesus Christ.
Isn't that something? Jesus.
Now, we got to get this guy Epstein. I'm coming down there tomorrow. I'm coming to Florida. We got to get this guy. He knows what happened.
Well, I'm going to be up there probably trying to secure the papers.
Yeah, okay. All right, I'm going to get in there tomorrow. I'm going to get a car.
Even when confronted with this recording, O'Reilly doubled down on his statement and said that he was there as it happened, but he never addressed in any way the smoking gun recording that we just played that proves O'Reilly was lying. Now, this is not central to the case at all, but it does tell me all I need to know about the trustworthiness of Bill O'Reilly's journalism. The big question around de Mansfield's death is whether or not it was really a suicide. I always assumed that it was obviously a homicide, given that de Mansfield had just hours earlier spilled the beans to Edward Epstein about J. Walton Moore, asking him to contact Oswald and him requesting help from the U.S. Embassy in Haiti with an oil contract, which, by the way, he did in fact receive and get paid for in exchange. Plus, de Mansfield had just been put on notice that the HSCA wanted to talk to him only hours earlier. If somebody wanted to keep George Demeron-Schulte quiet, it seems that the time to do it would be right before he told the HSCA the same things he was telling Edward Epstein. So, is there any actual evidence that George de Mansfield was killed by someone else? There seems to be some, but it's highly disputed. First, there's the coincidence that mafia hitman Charles Nicoletti, who was rumored to have ties to the Kennedy assassination, was shot to death in a clear hit on the same day de Mansfield died, March 29, 1977. I filed that under O. Isn't that interesting? It proves nothing as it relates to George Demeron-Schulte's death. Author Dick Russell asked Jean Demeron-Schulte, George's wife, whether she believed that he had taken his own life. She said, quote, "Nobody that knew him does." At the time de Mansfield was shot, the maid had been instructed to make an audio tape recording of a soap opera on television. Attorney Mark Lane, who attended the coroner's inquest into Des Moines Schulte's death, said that they played the tape at the inquest. On that tape, right before you hear the shotgun blast, you can hear a home security alarm going off with 5 consecutive beeps, Lane said. Quote, "I said, does that sound like someone came into the house?" And the coroner said, "We're not going into that." When Lane asked why, the coroner told him, "You understand why. This is bigger than all of us. We have to do what we have to do." Lane said that a woman on the grand jury at the coroner's inquiry also thought that the beeps on the recorded tape sounded like her home security system, but the coroner gave her the same answer that he had given Lane. They weren't going into that. So, we do have a fact that makes it seem like there could possibly have been some foul play, the beeping security alarm plus the doubting family. But the possibility that de Mansfield fired the weapon himself still seems most likely to me. Here's why. De Mansfield suffered from chronic bronchitis in the spring of 1976. He had severe bronchitis and sought medical treatment from a new doctor, Dr. Charles Mendoza, who had been referred to them. Jean said that the bronchitis was gone quickly, but her husband's personality suddenly changed, and he became increasingly paranoid. De Mansfield's wife said that he also lost his trademark confidence during this period of time. Eventually, Jean began to question Dr. Mendoza about what type of treatments he was giving her husband and insisted on being present during those treatments, but Dr. Mendoza wouldn't allow it. Jean found out that Dr. Mendoza had been giving her husband some sort of injections that Mendoza would not disclose to her. In the fall of 1976, Jean insisted that her husband stop the treatments with Mendoza. By that time, de Mansfield's condition had deteriorated to the point where he was checked into a mental hospital and had to undergo electroshock therapy. Here's where it gets even crazier. Researchers have attempted to track down Dr. Mendoza so that they could get his side of the story and put any claims to rest about Dr. Mendoza being some sort of intelligence-connected doctor who was giving de Mansfield harmful treatments to silence him. But Dallas County Medical Society records show that Dr. Mendoza registered in Dallas in April of 1976, less than 2 months before he began treating de Mansfield. And Dr. Mendoza left Dallas in December of 1976, just a few months after de Mansfield stopped the treatments. The forwarding address that Dr. Mendoza left with the Dallas County Medical Society turned out to be a non-existent address. Dr. Mendoza was gone without a trace. The police report for de Mansfield's death provides a lot of important contexts. It says that when de Mansfield's daughter told him about the HSCA investigator wanting to talk to him, she could tell that he was upset by that news. The shotgun that was found next to de Mansfield's body belonged to the homeowner, Nancy Tilton, who was the sister of one of de Mansfield's ex-wives. Tilton was out of town at the time. The headline for me from the police report is that de Mansfield had recently told his daughter that he was considering suicide and that he had made several attempts to take his life in the last year. So in the end, we're left with a few possible explanations for de Mansfield's death. A straightforward suicide, a suicide that was influenced by the medical treatments given to him by the mysterious Dr. Mendoza, or a homicide that involved a beeping security alarm that was never investigated. I tend to believe that de Mansfield took his own life because of the previous attempts and the condition he was in after being treated by Dr. Mendoza. But no matter how you look at it, the circumstances of de Mansfield's death are mysterious. They serve to underline the idea that if the CIA was involved in the assassination of President Kennedy, George de Mansfield is a prime suspect for acting as the agency's connection to Oswald from the fall of 1962 until the spring of 1963.